Warning: this stream will contain spoilers. So, if you don't want to know spoilers from Clannad, I suggest you switch to something else. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the stream. It's so good to see you. All right, well, we have got a lot to unpack today. As promised, it is Sunday. I do not have a book cover to reveal, so today will be an anime discussion. And today we are going to be discussing plot of Clannad. Now, I will do my best to keep this as spoiler free as possible, but as with any kind of stream where theories and explanations come into play, it's very important to realize that there are going to be spoilers and there will probably be a lot of them because of the fact that that's really where the meat and cheese, the explanations, and the reasons for the theories come from. It's very important to remember that. Also, it's important to remember that just because there are spoiler warnings in a video, it doesn't mean that the show or the movie or the book isn't worth reading because there's always so much more to it than the spoilers that are revealed. Clannad is a very, very deep story. It's miraculous in the way that it comes together. It's very, very bittersweet. And if you like that type of thing, I suggest you do two things. One, watch the anime, and two, play the visual novel it's based off of. Once again, this is an anime that is based off of a visual arts visual novel. Since I started Summer Pockets, I decided that I would start off with a series, and the series would, in fact, be a series of videos about anime created based off of visual arts key. So, with that out of the way, let's get to the actual discussion. Clannad. So, Clannad is the story about a young man named Tomoya Okazaki. Tomoya is someone who is very like the protagonist in Angel Beats. He he doesn't have a lot of drive. He doesn't have a lot of motivation in the beginning. He's very listless. In the beginning, it starts out with a monologue in which he tells people that he hates the town that he lives in, hates the situation that he's in. And it's important to realize the reasons as to why he hates them. One, because the town seems like it never changes. It's the same old story. Goes, gets up in the morning, he goes to school, then he comes home, and he describes that as a place that he would rather never go again. He would much rather stay listless in school all day than to go back home. The reason for that being is because Tomoya When he was young, his mother passed away. And after that happened, his father spiraled into a point of depression. And sometimes that point of depression became violent. And one day after very a very difficult situation, their relationship changed even further than it had already been. Tomoya didn't feel like his father looked at him as a son anymore. Felt like he looked at him as basically a stranger. He hated that. So as Tomoya is going into this monologue on his way to school, he is stopped by quite an unusual scene. And when you really think about it, these in itself isn't that unusual. But he stops on a giant hill surrounded by cherry blossom trees. And there's a girl sitting there, or standing there, with her hands folded, very innocent, looking up at the sky. And she seems to be having her own type of inner monologue. And first, Amoya doesn't, I think, feel like it would be worth her time talking to him. So when she's saying these things, he writes it off as she's talking to someone in her head or in her heart. There's absolutely no way in the world she could be talking to him. And suddenly she asks the question, do you like this school? Starts talking about how she really likes it quite a lot. But then her tone turns very melancholy and she starts talking about how she's afraid that someday all of the fun things will simply fade away. And Tomoya actually makes a very surprising decision. Decides to answer her. It's very simple. It's nothing groundbreaking. But he tells her, then find more. If the fun things are going to disappear, find more things that you love. It's easy, isn't it? And then the conversation changes. And it's almost as if these two have known each other for quite some time. Because then he just kind of passes her along and he says, come on, let's go. And they begin up the hill together on their way to school. As I said before, Tomoya is very unmotivated. He is the type of person that, well, he's hurt, obviously. So that plays into it. But he's listless. He really has no goals. No goals. I think he wants to accomplish. Nagisa, on the other hand, is very moved and suddenly very, very intrigued by what he said. Suddenly, she has this newfound drive that she didn't have in the beginning. Her newfound drive is to do exactly what he said, to find new things. What does she decide she wants to do? She decides she wants to revive the school's drama club. Now, this is important because the rest of the story is going to come into play during our discussion. But the backstory needs to be explained. Otherwise, it's not going to make much sense. So, Tomoya begins to help her. At first, it's this sort of feeling of he feels like he should. It's not necessarily that he wants to, but it's more like he feels obligated for some reason. But being the way that he is, Tomoya is very blunt. He's a very blunt individual. So when he's helping her, he tells her that in order to do what she wants to do, she needs to take charge. She needs to be the club leader, for one thing, and she needs to make other people understand why the drama club is so important to her. And Nagisa has a problem. She's very shy. She's soft spoken. She's she's very timid and she's got the drive, but she doesn't have the oomph. So as Tomoya is trying to help her, he asks her, why do you want to revive the drama club? What are you going to do? And she's having a very, very hard time answering this question. Not that she doesn't have an answer. It's not that she doesn't really want it. She does. She wants it really more than anything at the moment. But as I said, she's shy, very timid. She has this problem almost making her presence known. So, in the end, Tomoya ends up saying, I think the future is very bleak. And at first, like, when you first hear that, you think, oh, he's bullying her. He's being very rude, but he's not. That's the thing. Tomoya, the way that he thinks is he's stuck in this mode of needing to be very blunt. And so, because he thinks that's the best way to help her. And so, at first, you think, oh, he's being rude. But then it's kind of turns into this really kind of cute moment between them because he's like, "Yeah, I think you might be right." And says that, but he also said that she doesn't want to give up. So they get to work. Now, another important point is at the beginning of almost every episode, there is a pre-show, kind of a pre-scene, I should say. And in the very beginning, it opens up in a world where there's really nothing around, and there's this little robot, and he's having this inner monologue with himself, where he's telling this story about the fact that he doesn't know who exactly he is, doesn't know how he got there, but what he does know is that he lives in a world where nothing can live and nothing can die. But he is a companion. This little robot is the companion of the sole inhabitant of this world. It's a girl. So Nagisa has this plan. Tomoya is trying to help her, and they finally get a stance. And they're trying to figure out what the next step is. And Tomoya figures, well, obviously the next step is trying to figure out what kind of things you want to do in the drama club. Is there a particular play that you want to put on? And surprisingly, she has a really quick answer to this. She says, yes, there is. When he asks her what kind of play it is, though, suddenly she starts to have some issues again. Trying very hard to explain it to him. He says, it's a very sad play. So it's a drama? He says, well, but there are some very funny parts too. So it's a tragic comedy? Having a very, very hard time putting this idea into words. But when she finally does, something interesting happens. Suddenly there is a connection. It's as she's beginning to tell this story of this play, it begins to sound very familiar. It's the scene in the beginning. So you might think, okay, discussion over. This scene at the beginning is just a way to describe Nagisa's play. That would make things simple. Visual arts key, not simple. Later on, when they're trying to actually recruit members, Tomoya ends up asking a very particular girl if she wants to become a member. He had met her once before, but she's odd. She's very odd. Her name is Katome Ichinose. When he first meets her, she's in the library, and they're having this very unusual conversation. She's very friendly, but there are these quirks, these oddities to her. When he first sees her, she's reading a book, and then all of a sudden, you see her hand come out, and she's about to tear the page out of the book. Very quickly, Tomoya comes over, and he says, "You really shouldn't do that." It startles her, but she's very friendly towards him. But after that, getting communicating with her becomes complicated because whenever he says her name, she doesn't really pay attention at first. See, the problem is, in Japan, you have this very specific way of doing things. This very specific way that you're supposed to present yourself, and it's polite and it's the way that things are. And one of the things is that unless you are very, very close, and usually family, you are supposed to present or to call someone by their surname. In this instance, it would be Ichinose. But when Tomoya says Ichinose, and he calls out to her, she doesn't respond. Rattled and trying to figure out what to do, he finally calls her by her name. It's as if he just entered the room, and suddenly the conversation changes, and it's very normal. Well, I say that, but actually, it's very not normal. And not only that, but he has this persistence to call him Moya. So, she's a very odd girl. She makes him very flustered, but he thinks they'll get along, and they do. Moya, Nagisa, and eventually Hitomi become very unusual friends. There's a bigger story to Katomi Ichinose, but I'm going to leave that for you to discover if you actually decide to watch and or play Clannad. But the important thing to remember here is after a while, she begins to tell them her backstory. Her parents were scientists slash, I guess you could call them mythbusters. And there was this one particular story that they heard, and they were experimenting and trying to figure out if they could break through and find out whether or not it was reality. According to the story, way before our universe began, there was another world. And that world flourished. But when it came for our universe to bloom into existence, the only way for it to happen was The door to that world had to close forever. So we have strange world that seems to tie into Nagisa's play. And then we have a world that Katome talks about her parents trying to explore, trying to unlock. Very quickly, we start to realize it's probably the same world, and suddenly things are not easy anymore. Because it can't just be a play. If there are scientists actually trying to unravel the secrets behind it, suddenly this story has taken up an entire new life of its own. And this world has become way more expansive and complicated than ever. And it was about to become even more complicated. Later on, after the first part ended, there was another part, promptly called Clannad After Story. By this time, Tomoya and Nagisa were in a relationship and they were on their way to be married. They got married and they were about to have a little girl. Unfortunately, one of the things that Tomoya learned in the beginning about Nagisa was that the reason why she seemed the way that she did, she seemed frail. Even from the moment he met her, she seemed frail. And the reality of the situation is that she was. Nagisa was born with a disease that no one understood. It was never really explained. The doctors could not explain it, and it remained a mystery. But despite that, despite the whole idea that this unusual, almost mystical sounding disease could flare up at any moment and possibly take her away from him. And probably because of that, Moya took her as his wife. The disease flared up a couple of times within the first part of the series, but the most important time that it flared was during the after story because it flared up right before their daughter was set to be born. And the stress of the sickness and having the baby, unfortunately, was too much. Nagisa passed away during childbirth. Suddenly, Samoya, even though he didn't want to admit it, kind of understood the way that his father felt because it was happening to him. Suddenly, once again, he was left without a real purpose. He distanced himself, his family, his friends, and his daughter. Because he didn't think that he could do it. He didn't think that he had the strength to take care of her. So he asked his mother and father in law if they would raise her. They graciously agreed. But Moya was broken. But his mother in law knew that he couldn't stay that way. So she came up with a plan. She threw him in on the guise that they wanted to go on a trip together. He was reluctant at first, but he finally decided that yes, they would go on this trip. When he got there, however, mother and father in law had already left. And for the first time in years, he was face to face with his daughter, Ushio. Ushio, she was a bit of a handful, especially since Tomoya, all this time they had been separated, he didn't really know what to do. He didn't really know how to communicate with her or what, but he didn't really have a choice. He wasn't just gonna leave her by herself, so he began trying, sort of. He still tried to make sure that he was as far away from the situation as possible, but when it came down to it, he couldn't avoid her. And he found himself actually finally not wanting to. After some poking and prodding, finally he agreed that he would go on a trip with his daughter. They had a father daughter moment on this trip, and he decided that he was going to be a father. He was going to be different than the way his father was. He wanted to raise Ushio and be proud of it. But he had to get something else out of the way. And in this process, Tomoya did a lot of growing. And it was a good thing. So Tomoya and Ushio started living together. And for a while, everything was great. They were happy. He was happy to be with her daddy. He was happy to be with his daughter. And then the unfairness of life struck again. Ushio fell ill, and it turned out he had the exact same unusual, strange affliction that basically cursed her mother. But I'll tell you, that little girl, she was strong. And she pushed on, and finally, she had been telling Tomoya that she wanted to go on another trip. It was very important to her. Finally, he agreed. But he laid down some ground rules. He said that if at any time she started to feel weak, he needed or she needed to let him know, and they would play again another time. But I believe Ushio was fully aware of the time that she had left because despite going down, despite the pain that I'm sure she probably felt, despite how sad I'm sure she probably was, trudged on and he took step by step by step, trying to get to the train station. That inner daddy go on another train ride, another trip. Each step slower than the next. Moya ran out in front of her, caught her as she collapsed. And she fell unconscious. I know that was a lot of plot information, but it's important because this is where things started to fall into place. Because as you watched and you saw the things that were happening in the illusory world, as it became known to be called, you saw a very definite correlation. In the other world, the robot and the girl trying to escape. The girl knew that there were other worlds out there, and she told her friend that they would go together. And so they started compiling anything they could, any kind of junk, anything, and trying to turn it into something that they could use. But about halfway through, suddenly the world was different because it didn't have the clouds, didn't have the blue sky anymore. It was still empty, but it started to snow. And the robot watched as his friend weaker and weaker and weaker. And then finally, when she was covered in the white blanket, she revealed herself to him. And she explained everything that was. He once was in another world, and they were there together. And that world was Tamoya's. She explained that mysterious lights in the sky are the wishes and the pleas of the hearts of those in his world, floating up and breaking in and working into theirs. And that if enough of those wishes were collected, a miracle could take place. And as the world began to blink out of existence, time in that world began to fade away. Time in Tamoya's world reversed. And instead, pain, death, Tamoya, life. Instead of dying during childbirth, Isa, healthy, happy. And they could all three of them live. Moya, Nagisa, and Ushio. So, the point. The point of the discussion, the illusionary world. Why was it separated? Why was it segregated during the story? Why was it brought up as a play and then brought into reality? The easy answer would be that during the time that it was created, Visual Arts Key didn't know how big Clannad would be and how successful it would. And so, after story, the anime and the visual novel that came before it was an afterthought. That would be the easy answer. But I want to discuss two possibilities that are not quite as easy. Start at the beginning. Why was the illusionary world first brought up as a play? Well, Nagisa's parents were two very loving people. Her father was a bit eccentric, and it turned out before they were doing what they were doing when the story started, he used to be an actor. Now, when Tamoya first found out about Nagisa's disease, he told him a story of a time before before they were doing what they were doing now. When Nagisa was very, very young, they had to go to work. And the schedule was pretty simple. I mean, they had to leave her by herself for a little while. And normally, that was fine. I don't know, she played with the toys or something. But one day, they were late coming home. Nagisa, being the type of person that she was, became worried and she went out to go look for them. And this was a time where sickness, it they knew about it, but it wasn't as often. And so she began walking, and at first she just lost her footing. Then she fell unconscious. When they found her mom and dad, of course they were worried sick. They prayed, they made a wish. They said, please, anyone, anything, please save our daughter. And she did recover. Her father believed that from that point on, she was connected to the town, or rather, the nature. And that as the town changed, as time began to take hold and take form into present day, into progress, the town was crying out. So there was that connection that he believed was connecting Nagisa and this strange affliction that she had. So what does that any of that have to do with the illusory world? Well, First theory is this: the reason why the Illusionary World started off as a play was because it started off as a bedtime story. Maybe one day, when she was sick, when she was in bed, her father, mustering up all of the courage that he had, decided to tell her a bedtime story. And that story was about a girl in a world that was completely devoid of life, except for the one companion she had, a robot. And perhaps that story, in the very beginning, had a happy ending to begin with. Perhaps, according to her father's version, when they started looking for a way out, they found one. Maybe that was his way of describing the miracle that happened when Nagisa was cured. When the fever went down and she got another chance. When she lived. Now, her father, being the eccentric person that he was, and being that he used to be an actor, what do you think he would do? Well, as he's telling her this miraculous bedtime story, I would bet he acted it out. Nagisa's memory took that bedtime story, and the way that her father worked so hard to turn it into something so beautiful and miraculous, and remembered it like a play on stage. The play was her world. My second theory is that the reason in which the illusionary world was brought up twice was because there were two different people involved. See, there was this running joke between Nagisa and her mother, and that was the fact that Pamoya and her dad were so much alike. And those two hated that joke. Neither of them ever wanted to admit that they could ever be anything like each other. But in reality, they were a lot, were very similar. So the second theory is that the story was split into mother and child. Perhaps the story at the beginning of the story was Nagisa's. And the robot in the beginning, her father. And the idea that these two men, so similar, would actually play into a theme within the story itself, and that is, well, reincarnation. It's a little odd and slightly creepy from our standards, but maybe that's just the difference in uh, cultures coming through. Because as time went on, we actually see that there are a few different forms that this robot took before it ended up being who it was in the end. Maybe there was a form that it took that we never saw. Now, even that theory, it could have still turned into a bedtime story. But this one's a little different because as we get older and as we change, sometimes, and not just the fact that we're getting older and we're starting to kind of lose, our memory isn't as good as it used to be. But sometimes as we get older and we change, our way of thinking changes. Maybe Nagisa's father forgot what it was like in that world because that world was from the eyes of a child. He's a grown man now. So he had to draw on his experiences. He had the vague memory in the back of his head of something that happened to him, something that occurred in which, in the end, his daughter was saved. But because of the way that, they say, when I was young, I thought as a child, but when I got older, I had to leave childish things behind. And that's more true in more ways than I think we could ever possibly imagine. But it's not always a good thing. Think about it. The life and the wonder and the excitement and the magic that a child feels could be lost to time. If you really take the time to think about that statement, it's actually really sad. I agree that there are some childish things that should be left behind, but I think imagination should never be one of them. Unfortunately, sometimes it is. Maybe Nagisa's father lost the ability to believe in that reality. That it could have even possibly imaginably been a reality. And so he did the one thing he could do. He turned a very real and possibly spiritual experience into a bedtime story. But because Ushio was still a child, and because at that time, Tomoya was very vulnerable, there was that inkling, that fraction of a time when Tomoya not only could, but he had to believe. He had to believe that really was what happened because nothing else would have made any sense. Tomoya had to believe in the miracle of the illusionary world and the adventure that took place, where he lost his daughter but met her again, and then, with a single wish, was able to save his family. The two theories are very different, but I think when you really take the time to grip and hold on and to imagine it, either one is extremely possible. That's the thing. Again, one of the things I love about visual arts key is the stories are so crazy and miraculous sometimes that there is no way that you could see them in any other way except your imagination. You have to use it. Forces you to use it. Because nothing else would make sense. So you come up with these different ideas and these theories about the gaps that are in the story. And suddenly, the story is shared and it can live on. It's all of these possibilities keep coming and they keep coming and they come and they come and they do not stop. Because someone still has at least a little bit of imagination, a little bit of the eyes of a child, able to come up with something so amazingly miraculous, something so huge at its core, it's larger than life, but it's brought back down just enough to where it's relatable and you can apply it to life. Because everything, most every theme in these stories is completely true. There are things in life that are sad, they're unfair, that may anger you, but if you take the time, can find miracles just for this story. It was a single wish for your story. The person, a possibility, dream. That to me is just what makes all of this so